Hi again. It's nice to see y'all. As you can tell, I'm wearing the same sweater, so it must be the same day. I was lucky enough to have a few things get canceled today, so I got back to this part two video of chapter 3 sooner than I thought I'd be able to. So in part 2 today, we're going to discuss two different understandings of sacred power. The first will be one that we're probably not real familiar with. It's called Taoism, and the understanding of sacred power and the religion of Taoism is the Tao. I'll explain that as we go. And we'll also discuss along with that the person that's considered the founder of Taoism. His name is Lao Tzu, and we'll talk about him for a little bit. Then we're going to move on to an understanding of sacred power that we're probably a little bit more familiar with. It's monotheism in the bounds of Christianity. And along with that, we're going to discuss an 11th century monk whose name was Anselm. And Anselm formed a very famous argument that purported to prove God's existence. And this argument is called the ontological argument. In case you're wondering, ontology is the study of being. That's ontology. I can't even say it today. The ontological argument. Ontology is the study of existence or being. In this case, the argument is in favor of God's existence or being. In other words, it proves that there is indeed a God, at least according to Anselm. So after we get through talking about both of those two things, we're going to kind of compare the two, what Anselm wrote with what Lao Tzu wrote, and just see how they're different, maybe how they're the same. So let's go ahead and get started. Lao Tzu, what an interesting name. It's actually not his name at all. It means old uncle, but that's what he is always called. Lao Tzu was something of the founder of a Chinese religion called Taoism. Now it's also written Taoism with a T instead of a D. There's basically 20 million adherents or so in this particular religion, but I'm not too worried about how many people are in the religion. Lao Tzu is the man who wrote the foundational sacred text of Taoism called the Tao Te Ching, sometimes referred to as the Tao Te Ching. Once again, I'm really not concerned about which you call it. The book itself, the sacred text itself, dates from about anywhere between the 6th century BCE and the 4th century BCE. We don't have a firm date for it. But this is how it came about. Lao Tzu was a member of the educated elite in ancient China between the 6th and 4th century BCE. Lao Tzu was kind of fed up with Chinese culture of the time. He thought that culture had taken a downturn, that people were not paying attention to what was important, that looks and prosperity and social status mattered more than the important things, more than attending to the Tao. And he got fed up and decided to leave. Now, Lao Tzu was also a college professor, or what we would call a college professor. And he was a very famous one. He was held in high esteem. But he decided to leave. He couldn't take China anymore. He was going to ride off into the sunset and never come back. And so that's what he began to do. He got on the back of his ox, and truth to tell, until I heard this story, I never knew you could ride an ox. But evidently you can, because Lao Tzu mounted his ox and he headed off for the border of China. Now, China, like other countries in the world, had border guards. And once he got to the border guard came out and asked typical border guard questions. Where are you going? How long are you going for? Why are you going? Are you coming back? That type of thing. Lao Tzu answered the border guard and said, I don't know where I'm going. I'm just leaving China. I'm leaving because I'm fed up with the way things are going, and I'm never coming back. The border guard stopped and thought about it and thought, there's something familiar about this guy. And then it dawned on him, that's Lao Tzu, old uncle, our most famous scholar in the land. He knows everything about philosophy and spirituality. He understands the Tao like none of us do. And he stopped and he said, oh, you're Lao Tzu. You're not going anywhere. We need you. We need your wisdom. We need your knowledge. You can't leave. Well, of course, Lao Tzu said, oh, yes, I can. And the border guard said, oh, no, you can't. This may not be exactly how they did it, but they got into an argument. Finally, the border guard said, I tell you what, if you will sit down and write down everything you know that we need to know about the Tao and everything else, then you can leave. And Lao Tzu said, okay, I'll do it. And he did. He sat down and he began to write and write and write. He wrote down everything he knew about the Tao, about sacred power. He wrote down everything he knew about society and how it should function. And then, so the story goes, he gave all that he had written to the border guard. He got back on his ox and he kept riding, and no one's seen or heard from him since. Now, all that he wrote down was eventually gathered together into one volume and became known as the Tao Te Ching. This is the highest sacred text in all of Taoism, and it discusses, among other things, the understanding of sacred power in Taoism, known as the Tao. Now, what does Tao mean? Well, translated, you could call the Tao the way. In fact, many people say the way, or the path, or the road, or the process works just as well as far as translation. So just stop and think about that. This term, the Tao, for the sacred power, is saying that there is a manner in which you go, that if you follow this path, this road, this process, then you live in harmony with the Tao. Well, that's an odd thing. What's very odd, though, is that Tao is not the name of the sacred power. There is no name for this sacred power. It's considered nameless. And the Tao is not a thing. And you're saying, what do you mean it's not a thing? It's the sacred power. Yes, but Taoism is pantheistic. Remember in the last video, I told you that pantheism is the idea that sacred power is contained within and through everything in the universe. And this is how Taoism believes that the sacred power works. In Taoism, you do not pray to something that stands outside of the rest of creation. The sacred power is within all of creation. Once again, I'm sure you remember the first part of chapter 3 when I said that one of the best modern understandings of the Tao is actually of the Force from the Star Wars movies. And I know how silly that may sound, but it works that way. Very often, when you're trying to explain the Tao, people will tell you that there's two types of Tao. There's the unnamed Tao and the named Tao. The named Tao is considered the mother of all things. It's the well, it's not eternal, but it's there. It's kind of like Mother Nature in a way. It gives rise to everything. Remember, it's not eternal. The unnamed Tao, or the unnamed way, however, is the origin of heaven and earth. This is where everything began. Even the mother began here in the unnamed way. It is eternal. There is no beginning. There is no end. It will last forever, unlike the named way, which is not eternal and will come to an end. And the goal is to live in harmony between heaven and earth, between within the power of the Tao, without forced action, to keep things balanced, just like they should be. Now, here comes an issue that'll really bug you. There's not two Tao. There's not a named way and an unnamed way. There's just one. It's the unnamed way. The Tao is unnamed. It has no name because it is no thing. It is nothing. It is nothing separate from the rest of the universe, or from the rest of the universes, if you want to look at it that way. Everything is part of the Tao, and the Tao is part of everything. It cannot be separated. And so now you're really upset. And you're saying, well, Professor, then why did you say there were two? Because that's how it's explained to children. As part of the process of nature, if you think of the water cycle, if you think of the idea of an oak tree that drops an acorn, and then a squirrel finds the acorn and eats it and lives within the oak tree. The oak tree provides food and shelter for the squirrel. And then one day the squirrel gets old and dies there underneath the oak tree, and its body decays and fertilizes the tree itself. So the tree grows from the squirrel, just like the squirrel grew from the tree. And then once a squirrel buries an acorn, the tree gets old and it crashes down. But from that buried acorn that the squirrel forgets about, another oak tree arises. So this is the idea of the Tao. It's within everybody and everything, and it is continual. It's a cycle that never ends. It's there for all eternity. Many Taoists believe that immortality can be found by living in harmony with the Tao. But it's believed that nature and the cycle itself is sacred and extraordinary. It's mysterious. It's something that you can't explain. Why is it nameless? Why is it not a thing? Well, you can't give a name to something that isn't a thing. The term Tao is not a specific name. It's a reference, right? And because you have to have some way of calling it something. So in Taoism, there's not a god that you pray to, not many gods and goddesses that you pray to, not one god or goddess that you pray to. It's not a thing. It's simply that force throughout the entirety of the world and the universes. It's an interesting idea. Read this part of your book very carefully because it's probably a new idea to most of us. So let's switch now. Let's talk about Christianity. In fact, let's narrow it down and talk about monotheism, the belief in one God within Christianity. And we're going to start our talk by talking about an 11th century monk whose name was Peter Damian. Damian is spelled D-A-M-I-A-N. Now, remember too that in the 11th century, in the year 1000, monks were one of the few people, especially in Europe, where all of this is taking place now. We've moved from China to Europe. These are some of the few people in the world who are considered the educated elite. They're the few people who don't have to work from sunup to sundown to get enough food for people to eat and their family not to starve to death. They are about the only people that have time to sit and think about the nature of God and what it means to be monotheistic, what it means to believe in God, and what it means to accept, to even attempt to prove whether or not God exists. So just keep that in the back of your mind while I'm telling you what happened. It started with Peter Damian, a monk. Peter Damian, like many monks, would write down his ideas and his thoughts, and these became classics that are still studied to this day. Peter Damian said, human reason is incapable of properly understanding divine revelation. In other words, you can't know the same thing about God, especially about whether or not God exists, just through using your brain. You have to wait for God to show you who He is, or the fact that He is at all. The very fact that He exists, God has to be able to show you that. You're not going to be able to sit down and reason it out using your own logic. It doesn't work. He said the reason for this is that reason is expressed through language, which depends on grammar. Well, that's true, it does. However, he said, human grammar, human language indeed, is finite. That means it has a beginning and an end. So because it's finite, because it is limited in this way, you can't use human grammar, human language to discuss the sacred God, because the sacred is an infinite, that means without end, an infinite, eternal, goes on forever, divine reality. So you can't figure out if God exists. You can't prove God exists. You just have to wait for God to let you know that He's there. That's all you can do. Okay, I see his point. At the same time as this is going on, there was another monk whose name was Lanfranc. Lanfranc was actually Italian, but he served as the prior of the abbey at Bec. If you're wondering what a prior is, that's the person who is second in charge. And an abbey is, very often we hear that in terms of nuns living in an abbey, but monks can live in abbeys as well. Lanfranc said, wait a minute, Peter, you're on the right track, but he said, humans are actually created in God's image. This is a very old Christian point of view. Lanfranc said, and because humans are created in God's image, then they must have some sort of divinely bestowed gifts. In other words, God must have given them something of His own ability to be able to understand or grasp something of that sacred divine reality. And Lanfranc went on to say, you're right, divine revelation is authoritative for faith. God can show you who He is and the fact that He exists. But really, human reason can understand it, and they should try to understand it. One should try to use their own human reason and logic to understand God's existence, because not to do so would be to waste that great gift of being made in God's image. In other words, Lanfranc is saying humans have that little God spark in them. God gave it to them as a gift, and it's that God spark that allows humans to reason about whether or not God exists. So it is possible. Divine revelation works to prove God's existence, but human reason can do it as well. Okay, that was Lanfranc's idea. But then another monk gets in the conversation. His name was Anselm. Anselm's a very important guy. By the way, he lived from 1033 to 1109. He wrote a couple of very famous books. One was called Proslogion, Proslogion, and Monologion, Monologion. I'm sure you remember from our last video that that word logion comes from the word logos, or word. So proslogion means forward, and monologion means first word or one word, if you want to put it that way. Anselm believed that human reason and divine revelation would lead to the same conclusion, that indeed there was a God. And in his book Proslogion, he gives a very famous proof of God's existence. And you're wondering, why is she using air quotes? That's weird. Because when I say proof, I'm not talking about evidentiary proof. I'm not saying that we have an autographed photograph of God. Okay? It's not that type of proof. This is more of the type of proof you might study in logic class. Okay? This is an logical exercise indeed. This is how he came to this proof of God's existence. He was reading Psalm 14, verse 1. That says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And he started thinking about it. Why is it foolish to say there's no God? Now, he believed in God, right? Anselm believed in God. But why would it be foolish not to believe in God? Because when you think about it, if you start looking at the world, you see some things that make all kinds of people wonder about whether or not there's a God. Bad things. 3-year-olds get cancer. Good things happen to bad people. And sometimes we all wonder, is there really a God, a loving God that would allow these type of things? So while he believed in God, he could understand why people would have doubts and wonder, but the psalmist is saying it's foolish to say that God doesn't exist. And this is where he comes up with the ontological argument. Remember, ontology has to do with the study of being or existence. And in this case, it's the study of being or existence of God, him or herself. Listen to the ontological argument. First, just listen to it. Don't try to understand it, just listen. This is what he said. God can't be thought of as non-existent because God is a being than which no greater can be thought of. And if the greatest being ever can be thought of, then an even greater being would exist not only in the mind, but would also exist outside of the mind, because this would be the only thing greater than the greatest being that could be thought of. Therefore, there must be a God. Yeah, I know it sounds a little bit strange. What is he saying? What exactly is he saying here? He's saying if the greatest thing in the world that could ever be imagined by anyone, or by all of us together for that matter, if we call that God, that thought that we have imagined, that's God, the greatest of everything, then God must exist. Because if God is the greatest, if God is the superlative, then he must exist, because that would be the only thing greater than being a thought, would be if God actually exists. Yeah, I know. It's a little weird. And it doesn't always work, does it? I mean, if this worked, we could think of the greatest cupcake in the world sitting in our hand. Here's my hand. Let's think of the greatest cupcake in my hand, or in your own hand for that matter. It's the perfect cupcake. It's moist, but not too moist. It's your favorite flavor, and it's got that perfect, delicate little bing when you put it in your mouth. The icing has as much flavor as the cake itself, and it's decorated to perfection. Imagine the greatest cupcake ever to exist in the entirety of the world. Now look at your hand. Got a cupcake there? But the greatest cupcake to exist must exist. If it's the greatest, it wouldn't just exist in your mind, it would exist in your hand. But it doesn't. Where is it? Ah, that's good. That's good. Actually, Guineo, who was another monk, was thinking kind of the same thing. He answered Anselm's ontological argument. He said, Anselm, your reasoning is absurd. And he counter-argued with what's called the Lost Island refutation. His Lost Island refutation said, well, if we use your logic and imagine a perfect island that's lost that we don't know about anymore, but it's out at sea, but it's the most perfect island one could ever imagine, then it must exist, and you'd have no problem getting in a boat and rowing out to find it somewhere. Same thing with the cupcake thing, right? But Anselm wasn't going to take that lying down. Anselm had a counter argument for the Lost Island refutation. He said, Guanea, let me explain it, bud. He said, islands are contingent. That is, an island's existence depends on other things. An island's existence might depend on a volcano erupting with a huge lava flow. And then it depends on a bird flying over and dropping a seed into some earth that's built up on top of the lava flow. And then the seed grows into a tree, and like attracts like, you know how that works. It doesn't work for an island because an island's very existence depends on God. It's contingent. But God, he said, is not contingent. God's existence is not contingent. It doesn't depend upon anything. God's existence is necessary. In order for the island to exist, there must have been a God to create the lava, to create the volcano, to create the bird carrying the seed. But nobody created God. God is necessary for everything that is in existence, islands and cupcakes and everything else. Well, maybe not. But it's an interesting way to start thinking of sacred power. Sacred power, according to Anselm, is necessary. Who created God? Well, that's the monotheistic idea that God was not created. God is, God was, and God ever will be. And it's that way in the three great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, as well as several other faiths. So just keep that in mind. So when we compare Anselm's understanding of sacred power with Lao Tzu's understanding of sacred power, they're a little bit different. If you think about the language that each of the two use, Anselm is very theological and philosophical. He's abstract. God is a very personal thing for Anselm. God is a being. Lao Tzu, on the other hand, writes very metaphorically. He relies on the processes of nature and, in fact, on natural cycles, ordinary things. It's not personal. He doesn't see the Tao as a being, as a person, if you will. He thinks of it in a very poetic kind of way. In fact, in his text, the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu is not argumentative. It's very poetic, actually, and evocative. He stimulates wonder using cryptic statements and proverbs. What is the sound of one hand clapping? He makes you stop and think. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to see it fall, does it make a sound? Who knows? What does that mean? Anselm, on the other hand, is prayerful in his writing and argumentative. In fact, he starts with an argument, right? He wants some understanding about why is it foolish to say God doesn't exist? He draws conclusions. He uses reason to support his answer, whether you agree with it or not. He is using reason. Both of these men were part of the educated elite of their time. For the masses of both societies at both of their times in history, nobody had the time to sit and think about the deity, about any kind of sacred power. They were too busy trying to get enough food and to stay warm enough to get through the next day. Proving God, proving the nature of the Tao was not something that occupied the minds of most people on the earth. But both men recognize that sacred power serves as an ultimate thought. This is the highest, this is the lowest. This is what keeps us centered where we are and keeps our minds and our ideas focused and honed in. It keeps us from, how shall we put it, from flying off, so to speak. If you start thinking about how large the world is, think about where you are sitting and watching this video. Go up 20 feet and look down on yourself. Keep going up through the atmosphere and look down. Can you even see your house anymore? You can go until you are completely out of the Milky Way galaxy. And you look out and there are still an infinite amount of space. And you can't even see the earth anymore. But knowing that there is a sacred power that you come from and that you reside in helps us to limit our thinking and keeps us from going kind of crazy. And I don't mean to be, when I say kind of crazy, I'm not trying to be unkind with that, but it gives us a stopping point for our brain. And we all need that a time or two. So this was chapter 3. Please read your chapters. These lectures are not enough to help you pass the exam. Of course, it will help, but not enough for you to pass the exam. Read the chapters. They'll help you when you do your discussion boards as well. Chapter 4 will probably come sometime next week, or actually, I guess Hinduism, a lecture on Hinduism will come before that. So just be ready for it. And I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.